Morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, LinkedIn Live. How are we doing? How's your week been? Boy, it's hot, right? Here in the UK, we cannot complain, right? We daren't complain because who wants to go back to anything that's cooler? Just adjusting my lights here. Hope you've had a fantastic week. I've literally been melting, so I'm makeup free today, right? I'm just going to apologise just in case somebody's thinking, why is Cheryl not looking as put together as she normally is? Completely makeup free. It's just too hot for anything that looks like makeup. So today I am talking about a topic which I get asked about a lot actually, and I'm actually thinking about doing a LinkedIn learning session on this particular topic, which is about how you get leadership and management buy-in. But I was running some workshops yesterday here in the Midlands for a subsidiary of a global organisation, about 60 managers, leaders and managers, so the extended leadership team. And this topic around buy-in came up, and I was talking with the HR colleagues that had pulled the sessions together, and I thought I need to talk about this. So I thought I had something else planned for today, but I thought let me just tackle this while it's fresh in my mind. That constant challenge of how do we get leadership buy-in, because we know that it is really important for any change program. To be honest, it's really critical that you have leadership buy-in. But this particular topic, diversity and inclusion, and how we treat each other when we're at work, how we manage and lead teams, it's an essential that you have that leadership buy-in, and that cascades through. Because sometimes you have leadership buy-in right at the top level, but sometimes you then have almost like what's seen as this barrier level when it gets to sort of management, middle management, and so it doesn't always cascade down. So actually what I wanted to talk about this morning was, how do you get buy-in at all of those levels, and how do you almost like get some sort of system that you can use as you kind of cascade all of the the D&I initiatives and messages and values and all of that stuff down the organization. How do you do that consistently? So that's what I'm going to tackle today. You'll see a quote that I've got on this first slide, which is, never argue with a man whose job depends on not being convinced. And it's a great quote. I can't remember where I got that quote from. And there's another one that's similar that you'll see. Can't remember where I got them from, but I think it's a great quote. So what I'm going to cover is D&I. I think there has been a little bit of, it kind of reminds me of what I would call sort of schoolboy or schoolgirl football, as in, everyone sort of runs over to the ball when it's over there, and then everyone runs over there. So it is a little bit trend based, and I think almost to its detriment. And so I think there's something about, you've got to get away from that if you want the leadership team to be able to take it seriously. We've got to move away from it being trend, and also for D&I to operate at the highest level and be most effective, we've got to move away from it being trends and everybody sort of just rushing to the next shiny thing. D&I, when D&I exclude. So if you've seen the post that I put out this morning, and the commentary above this, it will be around the fact that some people are feeling excluded when they start to hear about diversity and inclusion, and when they start to hear about targets, and what does that do in terms of stopping buy-in, certainly stopping it going down, cascading through the organisation. And then the business versus the moral case. So if you are a practitioner in D&I, or if you're doing this work internally, you will know that there is often discussion around the business case on the one hand, which is, why are we doing this from a commercial viewpoint? And then there's the moral case in terms of whether this is the right thing to do. And there's something about the strength of both for your organisation and which one is leading which. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, we're going to finish with the how-to. So some very practical things in terms of how you can go about getting buy-in. So first of all, then, D&I is a trend. Oh my goodness. The one organisation that I love talking about as a case study when I'm doing this, because I believe that they are probably one of the organisations that are the least sort of like jumping on the bandwagon. And that organisation, which I love, and if you want to look into them, is Ben & Jerry's, right? So Ben & Jerry's were on the bus of social justice, social equality in terms of race issues, LGBTQ issues, etc., from way, way, way back, right? So we're talking, way before 2020, way before COVID, way before George Floyd and all of that stuff. they were just doing this. They weren't jumping on any bandwagons. They weren't out there posting their black squares and then realizing that they had to do something and then jumping on the latest trend. And I do think that DNI has suffered, certainly in the last few years. So since 2020, it's suffered from lots of people jumping onto it as a trend, and I say that even in terms of the space of DNI consultancies and DNI consultants and DNI specialists. There has been a plethora. I can say that I got into this field just before 2020. No, I was in this field for a couple of years before 2020, because from when I started writing my book, I started delving into the research of this field. But certainly, around the time of 2020, there was an explosion of consultants which differ. So in the consultancy space, so just to be clear, you have individuals, I guess, who are like me, who really look across the broad spectrum of DNI and look at it in terms of strategy, what do you need to do, implementation, what do you need to do across the whole breadth of DNI. And then you have specialists who are, specialists in a particular area, generally based on their lived experience. So you might have anti-racist consultants, particularly since 2020. You might have, for example, trans ambassadors who have lived experience. And they go in, or disability advocates who will go in, and based on their lived experience, they will be able to raise the awareness on particular topics. But all of this is grown, there's just been this massive explosion, and it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. But the thing that I would say is, if you're looking for sort of like longevity, you can't really think about this as a trend. You've really got to look at it more holistically, and whether that be internally with your HR team, your HR colleagues, or that you get a consultant in that does look at things more holistically. You need to kind of like look at the whole breadth of everything, how it permeates through policies, practices, reward, recognition, the whole shebang, really, rather than having it as these kind of just one-off initiatives that don't go anywhere. So again, diversity officers, coming off the back of 2020, there was a raft of appointments. I mean, ironically, some organizations, I feel, were almost like ticking the diversity box in terms of, we will achieve more diversity on our board by hiring a diversity officer who is, either a person of color or somebody with a disability, or somebody who identifies as LGBTQ. And that was the way they were like ticking a diversity box for their board. I mean, that in itself is a red flag, right? If that's how you're going about to achieve diversity on the board. But actually what we're seeing now, and some people will be aware of this, we're now getting layoffs actually in diversity teams. So as things are starting to bite in terms of, economics, and some organizations are struggling and some markets are struggling, and inflation and the state of the economy, we're starting now to see teams being laid off. I think what we're also seeing actually is some teams just maybe not performing and not delivering the results that organizations expect it to be. And that could be for a plethora of reasons. It could either be that the individuals weren't sufficiently qualified, but it could also be that the individuals weren't actually ever given the proper resources. The leadership team weren't bought in, and obviously this is part of the reason that we're having this conversation. So all sorts of reasons, but basically there has been an increase in people being laid off, and I think almost like there's been this almost like backlash now against DNI. So some of the things that I'm sometimes hearing, and I sort of quoted a little bit of it myself. We're hearing things like, "Oh, one-off initiatives don't work." And there is some truth in that, but I think it depends, because it's a bit like saying, I was thinking about this the other day, it's a bit like saying, oh, reading a book doesn't work. If you just read one book on something, it doesn't work. And actually, we know that there are people that will say, I read that book, or I, went on that course and it was life changing. And I have people, I work with organizations usually on sort of an ongoing basis, and I go in and do a few sessions. And I'm going in on Monday to do a session. And the last session I did with them was, say, 6 months ago. And one of the things the MD said to me was, she said, people are still always referencing in your session and saying, oh, we learned about this and this is what we're doing. And I think to say one-off sessions per se don't work, I don't think is correct. I think it depends on what is done in the session. and actually the mechanisms that are left to actually then be able to embed the learning that's delivered in that session. So my sort of caveat and my tips really around this one are, you don't want D&I to be just a trend, a fad. Don't be just like jumping on the latest thing. You've got to kind of like figure out what works for you. And when we get on to business case, you'll see why I think that is even more important. So one of the reasons I think it's difficult to get buy-in is sometimes diversity and inclusion, despite its title being inclusion, is sometimes being seen as being exclusionary. What I mean by that is sometimes you have men, in particular white men, feeling that they are not included, right? And I think there are several reasons for that. Sometimes I think almost there is too much emphasis on diversity, particularly diversity quotas. And here in the UK, we've had all of the recent hoo-ha or brouhaha or malarkey or whatever of the term you want to use about the RAF, so the Royal Air Force, hiring about diversity quotas. And this is part of the problem. And actually, that case in itself will not help now the D&I agenda in terms of getting buy-in. But basically, I think sometimes there's too much emphasis on diversity, almost like for the sake of it, too much emphasis on ticking boxes to, to get bodies, bums on seats, to get representation, without then the follow-on around the inclusion. Because actually, when it comes to inclusion is around obviously creating an environment where everyone can be themselves so that you get the best performance, you get diversity of opinion, you get innovation, you get creativity, all of that good stuff. But inclusion, from my perspective, inclusion should be not only for individuals or voices that have previously not been as well represented in the business. Inclusion should be for everyone, as in everyone should benefit from inclusion. Even men, even straight white men should benefit from the inclusion of the diversity and inclusion. Morning, Elaine. I hope you are well. Thank you for joining, and happy to see your comments on these thoughts if this is something that you've worked with clients on. So so sometimes I think there is too much emphasis on diversity and not enough on inclusion, because I think if we were doing inclusion in a very holistic sense, then there is no reason that some people should feel that they're not going to be included. So as part of the discussion with the leadership team in terms of buy-in, making sure the leadership team is aware that you are aware that inclusion needs to involve everybody. In fact, I sometimes say with some organizations, depending on where they are, and there is this thing about meeting people where they are, meeting organizations where they are. Sometimes I think, in some organizations, you have to lead with inclusion, because sometimes inclusion is the thing that it's easiest to get, kind of people around. And, my approach tends to be you meet people where they are, and if they're willing to go on that journey, but they're in that space of, we're a little bit worried that people might feel excluded, then lead with inclusion, and then get on to the more trickier topics. Okay. Avoiding silos. And I want to talk specifically here about employee resource groups and staff affinity networks. So for those of you that don't know what those are, those might be groups like, for example, a race and ethnicity network, or an LGBTQ plus network, or a carers network, or it could be any kind of either a protected characteristic, as a term that we use here in the UK, or it could be a historically underrepresented group, right, in your organization. You see, so set up these staff networks which become a place of support, a place that you can talk about what it is that the organization can do to better create an environment where individuals with those characteristics can thrive. What sometimes happens, though, particularly in very large organizations, and I think about somebody like, say, Netflix, who I know have 20 plus networks. Obviously, they're a very big organization. But there is sometimes a danger that you end up in silos, and you sometimes end up with people with specific identities or characteristics that are marginalized, sort of sitting in these staff networks and kind of like working on their own, needs, and not ever having that read across, or not looking across, and not working together for the common good. So I'm not sort of saying that I'm against employee resource groups that are set up in this way, but I think you have to be very careful to make sure, first of all, that they work across each other, sometimes through means of like a diversity council or a diversity committee, where they all sort of like converge at a central point and discuss common issues and how they can work together for the greater good. But I think the key thing is having a lot of cross fertilization. So having actually people with different needs in the different groups, so that you can do both, right? You can focus on the needs of specific individual groups, but you can also look at it from different angles, because that's the benefit of diversity, right? When you're working on complex problems, this is something that Matthew Syed talks about in his book Rebel Ideas: The Power of Diverse Thinking. When you're looking at complex problems, you want different thoughts. So actually, even when it comes to employee resource groups and tackling diversity and inclusion, we should want diverse thoughts tackling those issues. And this is kind of one of the challenges that I have around employee resource groups that are too sort of too siloed and too sort of insular. So that's my challenge around employee resource groups. Absolutely, we should be including men and whoever is the majority in that organization. So we do have organizations that are where it's a female majority. Sadly, we don't always necessarily see that escalating to the top. But whatever is the majority, we should be including those points of view in those employee resource groups as well. So this is around making sure that your D&I efforts are not exclusionary, that they actually include everyone, because I think that is a key part of making sure that you've got leadership buy-in. And then the business case and the moral case, right? So putting my accountant's hat on, I tend to go straight to business case. And when I was, when I was an accountant, and I was working in strategy and, working on some of the, big projects and things like that, I used to get involved in a lot of business cases, right? So I'm used to crunching the numbers, looking at the tangible and intangible costs and benefits around something. So actually, when I go into organizations, the business case is kind of like my happy place, right? Because it's a world that I'm used to. What I would say is, when you're coming up with a business case for your organization, and you're trying to convince the leadership of why they should be doing progressing these D&I efforts, I would say tailor make the business case and tailor make the evidence. There's a lot of business case stuff out there around diversity that I would say is very generic. It's things like, companies that have women on boards have, X% more profits and things like that. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm not sure how many leadership teams really buy that stuff. That's just my gut feel. I don't have the evidence to prove it, right? But I've just got a feeling that evidence it's too remote. It's too remote from them as a business. So actually, the business case stuff that I tend to use really depends on the client. But some of my favorite business case studies to use are around things like the specific link between innovation and diversity. And Boston Consulting Group, as an example, has a great study. It's a little bit old now. It's 2016, 2017. But I like to go to the specifics of, for your organization, what is the business case for your organization? And then where is the science that proves that business case, right? Don't just go to the leadership team with some generic thing of, diverse companies make more money. Really do the work to get the details of the business case and play that back in, because the individuals who are more, a little bit more like me, are more kind of like into the facts and figures and are more like the riders. If you're used to change being talked about in terms of riders and an elephant, you'll recognize that the rider is kind of like the logic in the head. And those leaders that prefer the logic will love that. They'll love that you've gone to the trouble to pull together a business case that is specific to your organization, right? Whatever your company is, whatever sector you're in. So that's the first thing that I would say. And then when it comes to the moral case is doing the right thing. Okay, so doing the right thing. Now, what's really interesting is I think actually, if you have a leadership team where, for example, your CEO or a senior sponsor already believes in the moral case, then you're kind of 70, 80% of the way there. Because once somebody believes it's the right thing to do, actually, that's the majority of the battle. I think half of the battle is where somebody doesn't really believe in the moral case and how you get them over the line, which is where we'll focus the next thing. But do you know what? Even just by splitting it down into a business case and a moral case will help that leadership team work through where some of the challenges are. And actually, I would present it to the leadership team in this way and get them to think about, as a group, as a team of peers, which ones of them are more or less convinced by the business case or the moral case, and almost like open out that discussion and allow them to have that open discussion. One of the difficult, kind of awkward questions actually that I sometimes ask leadership teams is, I ask them the extent to which they agree or disagree with this statement. If we progress the diversity and inclusion agenda, standards will be lowered in this organization. And I ask that question, and I ask them to kind of, indicate their agreement or disagreement to that statement. And more often than not, at least one person in the leadership team will say, I agree with that. I'm worried that standards will drop. And obviously, I don't lambast them for that view. And actually, as a leadership team, they then have a discussion about that. Why do we think that? What does it mean? How can we get past those fears? How do we mitigate some of those concerns? How do we make sure that our recruitment processes are robust so that we don't see a deterioration in standards, which of course, why should there be? But just creating the space to have those sorts of conversations is really important. So convincing the rider there is basically the logic, the head, the analytical brain, the thinking brain, and winning over the elephant. So the elephant is the heart, the emotion, and basically in the whole philosophy of change management and getting things done and being able to influence people. And certainly when it comes to leadership teams, you need to be able to do both. You need to be able to convince the rider with the analysis and the logic, etc. But you also need to win over the elephant. One of the ways of winning over the elephant, and I know some companies have invested time in this, is doing things like creating space for listening. So actually bringing employees in. So things like reverse mentoring can do this as well. But having like sort of listening sessions, via certain ways. It could be through book clubs or all sorts of ways. But sharing the lived experience of employees in the organization who have faced challenges, who have faced discrimination, for example, and getting leadership teams to hear that firsthand can be very, very powerful in terms of, that moral case, or the moral case of why this needs to be done. So if you're struggling, if you've maybe got teams that are very analytical, maybe you're in quite a sort of scientific or professional field and you're struggling to get the leadership team to buy in from like a heart-based place, then having some of those listening sessions can really help. So finally, just onto the how to. Listen. When I've put here listening, I mean actually listen to the leadership team, and I mean listen with your ears and with your eyes. So pick up on the cues. So what are you hearing and sensing from the leadership team that is potentially stopping them from buying into this, stopping them from taking ownership, right? And something I'm going to borrow from the values of the organization I was in yesterday: listen, seek first to understand, and then to be understood. So really listen to the leadership team, and if they have got concerns, take them on board and see, what it is you need to do around the program to maybe change things up so that the program will actually be effective. Maybe they're raising a genuine concern that will actually, if you can address that concern, will actually lead to a better program. So don't just dismiss it as, oh, I can't get that person on the leadership team on board. Actually listen to it, and see what you can do to change things up. B's and C's stands for benefits and concerns. I know some organizations call it other things. So some organizations call it pros and cons. Which is fine. B's and C's is something I got from an organization I worked with a while ago. So they would use the term benefits and concerns. Benefits and concerns, what I would suggest you do, you can either do this for the leadership as a team, or you can do it one-on-one. And what you basically do is you ask them to, on a whiteboard or on a flip chart, list out all of the benefits and concerns they've got, right? So you say, okay, we want to press ahead with this particular, D&I program, or it might be a specific element of it that they've got, you sense that they're not bought into, and just sort of say, right, let's get out. What are the benefits about this? What are the concerns? And just get them all out on the table so that you can actually understand what the issues are, so that they really feel listened to and that they feel understood. And then finally, my final point here is around creating safe learning spaces. One of the things that I've realized in this whole, area of diversity and inclusion, there are some really tricky topics here, topics that are difficult for some people to talk about, whether that be race, whether it be transgender rights, whether it be, disability, whether it be neurodiversity, whether it be mental health. Some of these topics are quite difficult, both from like a personal perspective, but also just in terms of it's such a fast moving landscape, right? Things are moving really fast. You've got sort of like Gen Z in terms of gender identity, all sorts of things. And I sometimes think that leadership teams almost feel as though they are being bombarded literally with information. They've got a viewpoint. They don't know whether it's right. They don't know whether they're allowed to say this, that, and the other, particularly if you are a firm that has a high profile. They know that if they say the wrong thing, for example, and somebody records them and puts it online or something, they're potentially out of a job. Like literally those sorts of things have happened, right? So how do you create safe learning spaces for your leadership team so that they don't feel exposed, right? Because there may actually be a high level of personal anxiety that they're feeling about this whole topic. So how do you actually create learning spaces just for the leadership team? And that could be through book clubs. Everybody knows I'm a massive book nerd, right? I don't have to say it again, but it could be just a really safe leadership book club, very, very small group where you, maybe it's a member of the HR team, or you bring in an external facilitator, or you get the author, the authors of these books, somebody like a Matthew Syed, who I'm sure is going to charge a little bit. They would love to go in and do, book clubs with some of these leadership teams, and it would be a real draw for the leadership team. So, a book club with an author to really sort of delve into some of these topics, delving into issues around transgender rights, delving into LGBT rights, etc., delving into race and inequality, delving into disability rights. The leadership team would love it, get a couple of authors in, really create learning spaces so that the leadership teams can become experts, and then actually they can decide, at what pace they want to go to. But you really want the leadership team to start to feel really empowered, really informed, so that they become the walking, talking champions, advocates, etc. And then I really think that buy-in becomes less of an issue. So those are some of my tips for today. I really hope you've enjoyed it. It was a little bit whistle stop. And I will leave a few more links below. I always say I'm going to leave links below in the comments. Inevitably, I jump straight onto my next call and I almost completely forget. But I hope you found it really useful. If you are struggling to get by in your leadership teams, you're not alone, for one, right? Lots of teams are struggling with this, despite the fact that loads of companies have put out statements, commitments, all of that. Internally, they are still struggling. Okay, so you are not alone. So that's it for today. I really hope you have found it useful. Thank you for joining. If you're watching on the replay, please leave your comments below. If this is something that you've cracked, love to hear how you've done that, and please share the love, because I know that for internal HR colleagues and D&I practitioners, it is one of the biggest challenges. And that's it. Hope you have an amazing Friday, an amazing weekend. If you're here in the UK, use sunscreen. That's going to be my last tip. All right, go with grace. Take care. Bye.